When I opened my bedroom door that morning and saw the mess they had made of our family photographs scattered across the floor, some torn deliberately in half with my face scratched out, I knew that the two people I had trusted to protect me had instead chosen to destroy the very foundation of who I was. Hello, my precious souls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is Grandma Ann, and today I'm sitting here in my sunroom, in Portland, Oregon, with my cup of chamomile tea growing cold as I gather the courage to share something I've kept buried in my heart for over 60 years. At 81 years old, I've learned that some stories demand to be told, not because they're easy to hear, but because they carry lessons that might save someone else from walking the same painful path I once did. The morning light is streaming through my lace curtains, illuminating the family photos on my mantle. Pictures of my children and grandchildren who fill my days with laughter and love now. But today, I need to take you back to a time when love felt dangerous, when family meant fear, and when I learned at the tender age of 11 that sometimes the people closest to us can inflict the deepest wounds. Now, let me paint you a picture of Bakersfield, California in 1962, where the summer heat would rise in shimmering waves from the pavement, and the scent of orange blossoms from nearby groves would drift through our neighborhood on Maple Street. I was Anne Patricia Collins then, 11 years old with sandy brown braids that my mother would weave fresh each morning before she left for her job at the telephone company. Our little ranch house sat on a corner lot with a white picket fence that my stepfather Robert had painted the previous spring, back when I still believed that fresh paint could make everything in our lives look as perfect as it appeared from the outside. My mother, Linda, was a woman of quiet strength and gentle hands, the kind of person who could make a feast from nearly nothing, and who sang softly while she folded laundry. She had married my stepfather Robert when I was 8, 3 years after. My biological father died in a construction accident that left us struggling to make ends meet. I still remember the day she introduced Robert to me, how she knelt down to my eye level with such hope shining in her green eyes and said, "Annie, this is going to be our fresh start, our chance to be a real family again." Robert seemed like everything we needed in those early days. He was tall and broad-shouldered with calloused hands that spoke of honest work, and he had this way of making my mother laugh that I hadn't heard since before my father's death. He worked at the oil refinery on the outskirts of town, coming home each evening with his lunch pail and work boots, greeting my mother with a kiss on the cheek and asking about my day at school. Those first months felt like stepping into a storybook, where stepmothers weren't wicked and stepfathers weren't cruel, where second chances actually worked. But Robert brought with him a 14-year-old son named Michael from his previous marriage, a boy with dark hair that always seemed to fall across his eyes, and a smile that I would later learn could mask the cruelest intentions. Michael's mother had died when he was young, and he spent weekends and summers with us, sleeping in the small guest room that we converted with baseball posters and a desk for his homework. At first, I was thrilled to have an older brother figure, someone who could teach me to ride a bicycle without training wheels, and who knew how to whistle so loud it could call the neighborhood dogs from 3 blocks away. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like most tragedies, it crept in slowly, disguising itself as normal family growing pains. It started with small things that my 11-year-old mind couldn't quite categorize as wrong, but that made my stomach twist with an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't name. Michael would accidentally walk into the bathroom when I was brushing my teeth, claiming he thought it was empty. He would insist on helping me with my homework, sitting so close that I could feel his breath on my neck while his hand would rest on my shoulder in a way that felt too heavy, too possessive. When I would try to move away, he would laugh and say I was being silly, that brothers and sisters were supposed to help each other. Robert, meanwhile, began to change in ways that were more subtle but equally unsettling. The man who had courted my mother with such gentle persistence began to show flashes of impatience, especially when she had to work late shifts or when I needed help with something that took attention away from him. He would make comments about how I was getting too old to need so much fussing over, and how my mother babied me too much for a girl who was practically a teenager. When my mother wasn't around, his tone would shift entirely, becoming sharp and critical in a way that made me feel like I was constantly walking on thin ice. The real trouble began in the summer of 1963, when my mother received a telegram that her sister Margaret in Sacramento had suffered a serious heart attack and needed immediate help caring for her 3 young children. Margaret's husband was deployed overseas with the Navy, and there was no one else who could step in during the crisis. My mother agonized over the decision for days, pacing our small kitchen while she weighed her sister's desperate need against her reluctance to leave, me alone with Robert and Michael for what could be several weeks. I can still see her sitting at our yellow Formica kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, tears streaming down her face as she explained the situation to me. "Annie, sweetheart, I don't know what else to do. Aunt Margaret is all alone with 3 babies under 5 years old, and the doctors say she could have another heart attack if she doesn't get complete rest. But leaving you here, even with Robert and Michael, it just doesn't feel right in my heart." I remember putting my small hand over hers and saying with all the confidence my 11 years could muster, "Mama, it's okay. Robert is practically my daddy now, and Michael is like my big brother. We'll be fine for a few weeks. Aunt Margaret needs you more than I do right now." How could I have known that those words would come back to haunt me? How could an 11-year-old girl understand that some people wear masks so convincing that even the people who love them most can't see the monsters hiding underneath? Robert was the picture of understanding and support when my mother finally made her decision. He assured her that he would take excellent care of me, that Michael would help keep an eye on me during the day while he was at work, and that they would call every evening so she could hear my voice and know I was safe. He even offered to drive her to the train station in Sacramento, but she decided to take the Greyhound bus instead, worried about him missing work for the long round trip. The morning my mother left was one of those perfect California days where the sky stretched endlessly, blue and the air smelled of jasmine from Mrs. Patterson's garden next door. She had packed 2 suitcases, not knowing how long she would need to stay, and she must have hugged me a dozen times before Robert finally convinced her that she needed to leave or she would miss her bus. Her last words to me were whispered in my ear as she held me close. "You call me if you need anything at all, baby girl." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Anything. Promise me. I promised, of course, standing on our front porch in my favorite yellow sundress, waving until the taxi disappeared around the corner. Robert put his arm around my shoulders in what felt like a protective gesture, and Michael stood on my other side, and for a moment, we must have looked like any other family watching a loved one depart. Mrs. Patterson even commented from her garden how nice it was to see us all supporting each other during a difficult time. The first few days after my mother's departure passed without incident. Robert maintained his usual routine of leaving for work early in the morning and returning in the evening, tired but pleasant enough. He would ask about my day, make sure I had eaten lunch, and even helped me with my summer reading assignments. Michael, who was supposed to be looking after me during the day, mostly left me alone to pursue his own interests, which I preferred anyway. I spent my time reading in the backyard, playing with our neighbor's cat, and writing letters to my mother that I planned to mail when Robert gave me money for stamps. But on the 4th day, something shifted. I woke up to find Michael sitting at the foot of my bed, just watching me sleep. When I startled awake and asked what he was doing, he smiled that unsettling smile and said he was just making sure I was okay, that he had heard me crying in my sleep and wanted to check on me. I hadn't been crying, and I told him so, but he just shrugged and said, I must not remember, that people often don't remember their dreams. The incident left me feeling uneasy, but I convinced myself that maybe he was genuinely trying to be a good big brother, even if his methods were strange. That same evening, Robert came home from work in a mood I had never seen before. He slammed the front door so hard that our family picture on the hallway wall rattled, and he went straight to the kitchen where he pulled a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet I didn't even know contained alcohol. My mother rarely drank anything, stronger than wine with dinner on special occasions, and I had never seen Robert drink hard liquor in our house. When I asked if everything was okay, he fixed me with a stare that made my blood run cold and told me that sometimes men needed to unwind after dealing with ungrateful people all day, and that little girls should mind their own business. Michael seemed to feed off his father's dark mood, becoming bolder in ways that made my skin crawl. He started making comments about how I was developing and how I would probably be really pretty in a few years if I learned how to dress better. He would find excuses to be in the same room as me, hovering around while I did my chores or tried to read, always with some justification for why he needed to be there. When I complained to Robert, he brushed off my concerns with an irritated wave of his hand and told me that I was being dramatic, that Michael was just trying to be friendly and I should be grateful to have someone looking out for me. The phone. Calls with my mother became exercises in carefully managed deception. Both Robert and Michael would be nearby whenever she called, and I quickly learned that any attempt to voice my growing discomfort would be met with sharp looks and subtle threats. Robert developed a habit of standing directly behind me during these calls, his hands resting on my shoulders in what probably sounded like affectionate gesture to my mother, but felt like a warning to me. Michael would make faces and gesture, threateningly from across the room, miming slitting his throat if I said anything that might worry my mother. My mother's voice, already strained with worry about Aunt Margaret, would brighten whenever she heard mine, and she would ask detailed questions about my days, my meals, my activities. I became an expert at crafting responses that were technically truthful but revealed nothing about the growing tension in our house. Yes, Robert was taking good care of me. Yes, Michael was being a good big brother. Yes, I was eating well and sleeping fine. Yes, I missed her terribly, but understood that Aunt Margaret needed her more right now. What I couldn't tell her was that Robert's drinking was getting worse each night, that he would sit in his chair with that bottle of whiskey and stare at me with eyes that seemed to see something different than the little girl I had always been. I couldn't tell her that Michael had started accidentally bumping into me in ways that felt deliberate and inappropriate, or that he had begun making comments about how lonely he was getting without any friends around, and how nice it was to have someone to keep him company. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon during the second week of my mother's absence. Robert had called in sick to work, claiming he felt flu symptoms coming on, but I could smell the whiskey on him even at breakfast. He spent the morning on the couch in his undershirt and work pants, drinking steadily and watching television shows that seemed to agitate him more with each passing hour. Michael was supposed to be helping Mrs. Patterson next door with some yard work to earn spending money, but he claimed he wasn't feeling well either, and lounged around the house in a way that felt deliberately menacing. I tried to stay out of their way by reading in my bedroom, but the house felt too small to contain the tension that was building like pressure in a kettle about to whistle. Every sound seemed amplified, the clink of Robert's glass against the bottle, the creak of Michael's footsteps in the hallway, the distant hum of the air conditioner struggling against the heat. I had just finished a chapter of Island of the Blue Dolphins when I heard Robert calling my name from the living room, his voice slurred but demanding. When I appeared in the doorway, he was sitting forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, looking at me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. Michael was sprawled on the couch, pretending to read a magazine, but clearly listening to every word. Robert gestured for me to come closer, and when I hesitated, his voice took on a dangerous edge that I had never heard directed at me before. "Anne, when I call you, you come, right away. No hesitation. Your mother isn't here to baby you anymore, and it's time you learned how to show proper respect to the man of the house." I approached slowly, every instinct telling me to run. But where could an 11-year-old girl go in the middle of a suburban afternoon? Robert reached out and grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to bruise but firm enough to make it clear that I wasn't going anywhere until he decided to let me go. His hand was hot and slightly damp, and the smell of whiskey on his breath made me want to gag. "You've been walking around here like you own the place," he continued, his voice getting louder with each word. "Acting like you're too good to spend time with your family, hiding in your room like some kind of princess. Well, let me tell you something, little girl. This is my house, bought with my money, and everyone in it shows me the respect I deserve, including spoiled little girls who think they're better than everyone else." I tried to pull my wrist away, but his grip tightened painfully. "Robert, you're hurting me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't being disrespectful. I was just reading. Michael laughed from the couch, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. "She thinks she's so smart with all her books. Maybe it's time someone taught her there are more important things than reading." What happened next would change everything about how I understood family, trust, and my own place in the world. Robert pulled me closer until I was standing directly in front of his chair, his eyes traveling up and down my body in a way that made my skin feel dirty. His free hand reached out and touched my face, running his fingers along my cheek in a gesture that was clearly not paternal. "You know, you're starting to look more and more like your mother every day," he said, his voice taking on a tone that I didn't recognize, but that filled me with a terror so complete it seemed to freeze my blood. Same pretty face, same stubborn attitude. "Maybe it's time you learned what it means to be a woman in this family." I don't remember making a conscious decision to scream, but suddenly sound was pouring out of my throat like water from a broken dam. I yanked my wrist away with strength I didn't know I possessed and ran toward the front door, thinking only of reaching Mrs. Patterson's house next door. But Michael was faster, launching himself from the couch and catching me before I could reach the door handle. His arms wrapped around me from behind, lifting me off my feet as I kicked and struggled. "Where do you think you're going?" he hissed in my ear. "You can't run away from family, Anne. We're all you've got now." They carried me back to the living room despite my struggles, Robert now standing and swaying slightly, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. What followed was a systematic breaking down of everything I had believed about safety, about family, about my own worth as a human being. They took turns holding me while the other spoke, their words designed to convince me that my mother had abandoned me, that no one would believe me if I told them what was happening, that this was somehow normal and something I should accept. Robert's hands roamed over my body while Michael held my arms, both of them laughing at my tears and telling me that this was what growing up meant, that all families had secrets, and that if I told anyone what was happening, they would make sure my mother knew what a liar and troublemaker I was. They threatened to call her and tell her I was being disrespectful and difficult, that maybe she should just leave me with them permanently since I clearly needed a firmer hand than she could provide. The physical violation was horrific enough, but what hurt even more was the systematic destruction of my sense of self that accompanied it. They told me I was worthless, that my mother had left because she was tired of dealing with me, that no one would ever love me if they knew how dirty and damaged I was. They made me repeat back to them that I deserved what was happening, that I had somehow asked for it by being too friendly or too pretty or too something that justified their actions. When they were finally finished with me, they left me crumpled on the living room floor while they went to clean themselves up, warning me that if I said anything to anyone, they would hurt my mother when she came back. Michael leaned down close to my ear and whispered that they knew where Aunt Margaret lived, that it would be easy to make something bad happen to my mother if I didn't keep our family business private. I lay there on the carpet that my mother had picked out the previous spring, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how the world could have changed so completely in the space of a few hours. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was considerable. The worst part was the knowledge that the two people who were supposed to protect me had instead chosen to destroy something inside me that I didn't even have words for yet. That night, I lay in my bed with a chair pushed against the door, listening to every sound in the house and jumping at every creak of the floorboards. I wrote a letter to my mother, trying to find words for what had happened without actually saying anything that might get back to Robert and Michael. But every attempt felt either too vague to convey the urgency of my situation or too explicit to risk putting in writing. I ended up tearing up draft after draft, the pieces scattered around my floor like the fragments of my former life. The days that followed established a horrific routine. Robert would leave for work in the morning, kissing my forehead in a mockery of paternal affection while whispering threats about what would happen if I misbehaved while he was gone. Michael would spend the day tormenting me in increasingly creative ways, making it clear that I was completely at their mercy and that my suffering was a source of entertainment for him. When Robert returned each evening, they would often repeat their attacks, each time finding new ways to break down my resistance and reinforce their control over me. They were careful never to leave marks that would be visible in normal clothing, and they coached me extensively on what to say during the nightly phone calls with my mother. I became a master of sounding normal while dying inside, of crafting responses that would reassure her while revealing nothing about the hell my life had become. The worst part was how easily the lies came, how quickly I learned to perform the role of the well-cared-for stepdaughter, while my soul withered a little more each day. My mother's voice became both my lifeline and my torture. I lived for those nightly calls, but I also dreaded them because they reminded me of the life I had lost and the safety I could no longer access. She would tell me about Aunt Margaret's slow recovery, about my little cousins who missed their daddy, about how proud she was of me for being such a brave and mature girl during this difficult time. If only she had known that her brave, mature girl was being systematically destroyed by the very people she had trusted to keep me safe. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, because it came from people who were supposed to love me. Robert wasn't some stranger who had broken into our house. He was the man my mother had chosen to be my stepfather, the man who was supposed to fill the role my biological father could no longer fulfill. Michael wasn't some random bully from school. He was supposed to be my big brother, someone who would protect me and teach me about the world. Instead, they had joined forces to teach me that trust was dangerous, that family could be the source of your greatest pain, and that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most capable of destroying you. As the days stretched into weeks, I began to understand that I was fighting not just for my physical safety, but for my very survival as a person. They were trying to convince me that I was nothing, that I deserved their treatment, that this was simply my lot in life. But something deep inside me, some core of strength that they hadn't been able to reach, refused to accept their version of reality. I might have been powerless to stop what they were doing to my body, but I could protect the essential part of myself that knew this was wrong, that knew I deserved better, that knew my mother would move heaven and earth to save me, if she only knew what was happening. That knowledge became my secret weapon, the thing I held onto when everything else felt lost. No matter what they did to me, no matter what they made me say or do, I never stopped believing that this was not my fault, that I was not worthless, and that someday, somehow, I would find a way to escape this nightmare and reclaim my life part. 2. The deepening nightmare. It was during the third week of my mother's absence that I discovered they had been going through her personal belongings, rifling through her jewelry box and reading her private letters like they were searching for ammunition to use against both of us. I found Michael in my mother's bedroom one morning, sitting on her perfectly made bed with her diary open in his lap, a cruel smile playing across his lips as he read her most intimate thoughts aloud to Robert, who leaned against the doorframe, drinking his morning whiskey like it was coffee. They were reading passages about her worries over leaving me, her fears that she wasn't being a good enough mother, her concerns about whether Robert truly cared for me or just tolerated me for her sake. Michael's voice dripped with mockery as he read her words. I pray every night that Annie feels loved and safe in this house. Sometimes I catch Robert looking at her strangely, but surely I'm just being an overprotective mother. He would never hurt her. Would he? The question mark at the end of that entry hung in the air like a prophecy, and both men laughed as if my mother's maternal instincts were the funniest joke they had ever heard. Robert snatched the diary from Michael's hands and flipped through. More pages, stopping at an entry from the week before she left. His voice was thick with whiskey and contempt as he read, "Annie is growing up so fast. Yesterday I found her crying because her body is starting to change, and she's confused about what it all means. I tried to explain that becoming a woman is beautiful, but I worry I'm not equipped to guide her through this alone. Maybe having Robert and Michael around will help her feel less isolated." Robert slammed the diary shut and looked directly at me standing frozen in the doorway. "Well, Anne, looks like your precious mama wanted us to help you understand what it means to be a woman. We're just following her wishes." The violation of my mother's privacy felt almost as devastating as what they had done to me physically. These were her secret thoughts, her fears and hopes written in the quiet moments before sleep, never meant for anyone else's eyes. Seeing them use her own words to justify their cruelty made me understand that nothing in our house was sacred. To them, that they would corrupt and twist anything beautiful or pure to serve their twisted purposes. They had turned my mother's love for me into a weapon against both of us, and the realization filled me with a rage so pure it temporarily burned through my fear. I tried to grab the diary from Robert's hands, but he held it high above my head, while Michael grabbed my arms from behind, both of them laughing at my desperate attempts to protect what little remained of my mother's dignity. Robert opened the diary again and began tearing out pages, letting them flutter to the floor like wounded birds. "Maybe we should write our own entries," he suggested, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "Tell Mommy all about what her little girl has been learning while she's been gone." Michael's grip tightened on my arms until I cried out in pain. "We could tell her how much Annie enjoys our special family time," he whispered in my ear, his breath hot and sour against my skin. "How she begs us not to stop. How she says she loves being part of a real family." The lies were so vile, so completely opposite to the truth of my terror and revulsion, that for a moment I couldn't even find breath to protest. They were creating an alternate reality where my suffering was transformed into willing participation, where my victimization became complicity. It was then that I realized they weren't just hurting me for their own sick pleasure. They were systematically destroying any possibility of my ever being believed or rescued. They were building a narrative where I was not just a victim, but a willing participant, someone who could never claim innocence because I had supposedly asked for everything that happened to me. The sophistication of their psychological warfare was terrifying in someone as young as Michael, and I began to understand that Robert had been training his son in these techniques for years, probably since his own mother died. The phone calls with my mother became increasingly difficult as they began coaching me more extensively on what to say. They would rehearse conversations with me beforehand, with Michael playing the role of my mother while Robert stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders, guiding my responses. They created elaborate scenarios about fun activities we had supposedly done together, places we had gone, meals Robert had cooked for me. I became fluent in a language of lies so detailed and consistent that sometimes I almost believed them myself. During one particularly cruel rehearsal, they made me practice telling my mother how much I missed her, but how grateful I was to have such a loving stepfather and stepbrother taking care of me. Michael, imitating my mother's worried voice, would ask probing questions. "Are you sure you're eating enough, honey? Are you sure Robert is being kind to you? Are you sure you don't need me to come home early?" And I was forced to respond with enthusiasm about how wonderful everything was, how much I was learning about being part of a real family, how I didn't want her to worry about me when Aunt Margaret needed her so much. The most insidious part of their manipulation was how they gradually convinced me that I was somehow responsible for what was happening. They would point out that I hadn't screamed loud enough for the neighbors to hear, that I hadn't tried hard enough to escape, that I must secretly want what they were doing or my body would have fought back more effectively. They told me that Good girls didn't find themselves in situations like this, that if I had been truly innocent and pure, God would have protected me from harm. Robert developed a particularly cruel habit of making me look at myself in the mirror after their attacks, forcing me to see my tear-streaked face, my disheveled clothes, my defeat written in every line of my small body. "Look at yourself," he would say, his voice heavy with disgust. "Look how dirty you are, how shameful. What would your mother think if she could see you now? What would your father think if he was still alive?" The implication was always that I had somehow chosen this degradation, that I was responsible for my own destruction. Michael took a different approach, alternating between mock sympathy and cruel taunting. He would sometimes hold me afterward, stroking my hair in a grotesque parody of comfort, while whispering that this was just how families showed love to each other, that I was lucky to have people who cared enough about me to teach me important lessons about life. Other times he would laugh at my tears and tell me that I was pathetic, that I cried too much, that no wonder my real father had died rather than stick around to deal with such a whiny, ungrateful daughter. They began taking photographs, Polaroid pictures that they claimed were just innocent family snapshots, but that I knew were being taken for far more sinister purposes. Robert had an old camera that he said belonged to his deceased first wife, and he would set it up on a tripod and force me to pose in ways that made my skin crawl. They told me the pictures were to send to my mother so she could see how well I was being cared for, but something in their eyes when they looked at those developing images told me they had other plans for them. The isolation became total during this period. They stopped allowing me to go outside except when absolutely necessary, and then only under strict supervision. My summer freedom, which should have been filled with bicycle rides and games with neighborhood children, became a prison sentence. They told Mrs. Patterson next door that I had come down with a summer flu and needed to rest indoors, and she was kind enough to send over homemade soup and get-well cards that I was never allowed to answer. They monitored every aspect of my daily life with obsessive control. I had to ask permission to use the bathroom, to get a glass of water, to change my clothes. They would stand outside the bathroom door when I was inside, timing how long I took, and demanding to know what I was doing if I stayed longer than they deemed appropriate. They searched my room daily, looking for any evidence that I might be planning to tell someone what was happening or trying to contact my mother outside of the supervised phone calls. Food became another tool of control. They would prepare elaborate meals for themselves while giving me only small portions of plain bread and water, telling me that I needed to learn to be grateful for what I was given. Sometimes they would dangle the promise of a real meal in front of me, making me perform degrading acts or repeat humiliating phrases in exchange for a piece of fruit or a small serving of whatever they were eating. The constant hunger weakened me physically and made it even harder to resist their demands. Sleep became elusive as they began waking me at all hours of the night, claiming they needed to check on me or that I had been making noise that disturbed them. I would be jolted awake by Robert shaking my shoulder, his whiskey breath filling my nostrils as he demanded to know what I had been dreaming about, whether I had been thinking about telling anyone our family secrets. Michael would sometimes crawl into my bed in the middle of the night, claiming he was lonely or scared, and I would lie rigid beside him, afraid to move or make any sound that might provoke him. The psychological torture was relentless and methodical. They would tell me contradictory things and then punish me for being confused. They would promise rewards for good behavior and then move the goalposts at the last minute, explaining that I hadn't quite earned the privilege after all. They would alternate between treating me like a baby who couldn't be trusted with any responsibility and like an adult who should understand the adult world they were introducing me to. They began forcing me to write letters to my mother, dictating the content while I struggled to make my handwriting look natural despite my shaking hands. These letters painted a picture of domestic bliss, describing wonderful family dinners and fun activities that existed only in their twisted imaginations. I wrote about how Robert had taught me to ride a bicycle without training wheels, how Michael had helped me with my math homework, how grateful I was to have such a loving family, taking care of me. Every word felt like acid in my mouth, but I wrote them because the alternative was always worse. The most devastating realization came when I understood that they were planning for this to continue even after my mother returned. They spoke openly about how things would be different when she came back, how I would know my place in the family hierarchy and wouldn't cause any trouble. They described a future where I would keep their secrets not just out of fear, but out of a twisted sense of loyalty, where I would become complicit in my own continued abuse because I would be too damaged and ashamed to seek help. Robert began, talking about sending me to a boarding school, claiming that my mother would eventually see that I needed more discipline than she could provide at home. He painted this as a generous offer, a way to give me opportunities that a working mother couldn't afford, but I understood it was actually a threat. If I didn't cooperate fully, if I showed any signs of planning to expose them, they would find a way to separate me from my mother permanently, ensuring that I would never be able to tell her what had really happened during her absence. Michael seemed to relish the long-term planning aspect of their scheme. He would describe how he would visit me at boarding school, how we would continue our special relationship away from prying eyes. He talked about how when I got older, when I turned 16 or 17, I would understand that what they were doing was actually love, that I would be grateful to them for teaching me about life in a way that sheltered girls never learned. The casual way he discussed my future victimization, as if it were already decided and I had no say in the matter, filled me with a despair so complete that some days I wondered if it might be easier to simply stop fighting altogether. But even in my darkest moments, something inside me refused to surrender completely. Perhaps it was the memory of my mother's gentle hands braiding my hair each morning, or the sound of her voice singing while she folded laundry, or the way she used to read to me before bedtime with such infinite patience and love. Perhaps it was the echo of my real father's voice telling me bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved themselves when no prince was coming to rescue them. Whatever it was, it kept a tiny flame of defiance burning in the deepest part of my heart, hidden so well that even I sometimes forgot it was there. I began to notice patterns in their behavior, small details that might be useful if I ever found an opportunity to escape or seek help. Robert always drank more heavily on the weekends, becoming sloppier and less careful about covering his tracks. Michael was more vulnerable when his father wasn't around, less confident in his cruelty when he didn't have Robert's approval and encouragement. They both became careless when they thought they had broken me completely, letting their guard down, in small ways that I filed away in my memory like pieces of a puzzle I might someday be able to assemble into a weapon. I also began to understand the depth of my mother's love through their very attempts to convince me she had abandoned me. The fact that they spent so much energy trying to turn me against her told me that they feared her return, that they knew she would recognize the changes in me if they weren't careful. Their elaborate coaching sessions for the phone calls revealed how well they knew that my mother's intuition was a real threat to their plans. This knowledge became a source of strength, a reminder that I was not as alone as they wanted me to believe. The days blurred together in a haze of fear and pain, but I began to mark time in small ways that they couldn't control. I would count the birds I could see from my bedroom window, or try to remember every detail of my mother's face, or recite in my mind all the books I had ever read. These mental exercises became a form of resistance, a way of keeping the essential parts of myself alive despite their attempts to destroy them. As the 4th week of my mother's absence began, I could sense a change in the atmosphere of the house. Robert and Michael seemed more relaxed, more confident in their control over me. They began talking openly about their plans for the future, discussing how they would handle my mother's return, and what adjustments they would need to make to their methods to avoid detection. Their casual planning of my continued suffering filled me with a terror deeper than anything I had experienced yet, because I realized they truly believed they had broken me completely, but they had underestimated the power of a mother's love. and the strength that could be found in the most desperate circumstances. What they didn't know was that my mother's intuition was already telling her something was wrong, that her heart was already calling her home, despite Aunt Margaret's continued need for help. What they couldn't have predicted was that sometimes the universe conspires to protect the innocent, sending help from the most unexpected directions at exactly the moment when all hope seems lost. The storm that had been building in my young life was about to break, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Part 3. The Point of No Return. The morning I found the suitcase hidden under Robert's bed changed everything I thought. I knew about their plans for me. I had been sent to retrieve his work boots from the bedroom closet, a simple task that should have taken only moments. But as I knelt to reach the boots in the back corner, my hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. Hidden beneath old blankets and forgotten winter clothes was a small brown leather suitcase that I had never seen before. And something about the way it was concealed made my heart start racing with a dread I couldn't yet name. My hands trembled as I pulled the suitcase toward me, glancing repeatedly at the bedroom door to make sure neither Robert nor Michael was approaching. The latches opened with soft clicks that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet house, and what I found inside made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There were photographs, dozens of them, but not the innocent family snapshots they had claimed to be taking. These images showed me in states of undress and vulnerability that made me feel sick to look at, captured during moments when I had been too traumatized or exhausted to realize what they were doing. But worse than the photographs were the documents I found beneath them. There was a birth certificate with my name on it, but the parents listed were Robert and a woman I had never heard of named Helen Morrison. There was a social security card with my name, but a different number than the one my mother had always used for tax purposes. There was even a school enrollment form for a place called Riverside Academy for Girls, located in what appeared to be Nevada, with my signature forged at the bottom and Robert listed as my legal guardian. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the papers as I began to understand the scope of their planning. They weren't just planning to continue abusing me after my mother returned. They were planning to take me away entirely, to create a false identity that would make it impossible for my mother to ever find me. The boarding school Robert had mentioned wasn't a threat for future misbehavior. It was their destination, a place where they could control me completely without any interference from my mother or anyone else who might question what they were doing to me. Hidden beneath the documents was a letter in Robert's handwriting, apparently a draft of something he planned to send to my mother. The words swam before my eyes as I read his explanation of how I had become increasingly troubled and rebellious, how I had begun acting out in ways that concerned him deeply, how he had consulted with experts who recommended immediate placement in a specialized facility for disturbed children. He wrote about how difficult it had been to make this decision, how much it pained him to see me struggling, but how he felt it was the only way to get me the help I desperately needed. The letter described incidents that had never happened, behaviors I had never exhibited, conversations with school counselors and child psychologists who didn't exist. It painted a picture of a deeply troubled child who was beyond her mother's ability to help, who needed the kind of intensive intervention that only a residential facility could provide. Robert had even included fictional quotes from these imaginary professionals, stating that children with my particular type of disturbance often did better when separated from their primary attachment figures, allowing them to form new, healthier relationships with trained staff. What made the letter even more chilling was how reasonable it sounded, how carefully crafted to appeal to my mother's love for me and her desire to do what was best for my future. He wrote about how painful it would be for her to be separated from me, but how this sacrifice would ultimately save my life and give me a chance at normalcy. He even included information about visiting schedules and family therapy sessions, creating the illusion that this separation would be temporary and therapeutic rather than the permanent kidnapping it actually was. At the bottom of the suitcase, wrapped in a soft cloth like something precious, was a small glass vial filled with white powder. I didn't know what it was, but finding it hidden with all these other sinister items filled me with a terror so complete that I began to hyperventilate. Were they planning to drug me to make the transport easier? Was this something they intended to use to make me compliant or to silence me permanently? The possibilities that raced through my mind were so horrifying that I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. I carefully returned everything to its original position and crept out of the room, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they would be able to hear it from anywhere in the house. Robert was in the kitchen making himself a sandwich for lunch, humming tunelessly as he spread mustard on bread with the casual contentment of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as he intended. Michael was sprawled on the living room couch, reading a comic book and occasionally laughing at something on the pages. They both looked so normal, so utterly ordinary, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the entire contents of that suitcase. But the images were burned into my memory with crystal clarity, and I knew that I had just discovered my death warrant. Not a literal death, perhaps, but the death of Anne Patricia Collins, the death of my identity, my history, my connection to everyone and everything I had ever loved. They were planning to erase me as completely as if I had never existed, replacing me with some fictional troubled child who needed to be hidden away from the world for her own good and the safety of others. The rest of that day passed in a surreal haze as I went through the motions of normal interaction while my mind raced frantically, trying to figure out what to do with this terrible knowledge. Every smile I forced, every casual response to their questions, every moment of pretending that nothing had changed felt like another step toward my own grave. They seemed to notice nothing unusual about my behavior. So confident were they in their control over me, so certain that I had been thoroughly broken and would never dare to oppose them. That evening, during the nightly phone call with my mother, I came closer than ever before to breaking down completely and telling her everything. Her voice sounded tired and strained as she told me about Aunt Margaret's slow recovery, about the challenges of caring for 3 young children while managing a household, about how much she missed me and counted the days until she could come home. When she asked how I was doing, there was something different in her tone, a note of concern that made me wonder if she was beginning to sense that something was wrong, despite all my carefully coached responses. "Annie, sweetheart, you sound different tonight," she said, and I could hear the worry creeping into her voice. "Are you sure everything is okay there? You sound so quiet, so unlike yourself." Robert was standing directly behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders in what probably sounded like a gesture of comfort, but felt like a warning, while Michael sat across from me making throat-slitting gestures and pointing toward the door that led to Robert's bedroom where that suitcase full of nightmares waited. I wanted so desperately to scream into the phone, to tell her about the photographs and the false documents and the letter that would steal me away from her forever. I wanted to beg her to come home immediately, to bring the police, to save me before it was too late. But Robert's grip on my shoulders tightened just enough to remind me of what would happen if I said anything out of line. And Michael's silent. Threats across the room reinforced the lesson I had learned so painfully over the past weeks. "I'm just tired, Mama," I managed to say, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "It's been really hot here, and I haven't been sleeping very well." It wasn't entirely a lie, since sleep had become increasingly elusive as my situation grew more desperate, but it was such a pale shadow of the truth that it felt like another form of betrayal. My mother's maternal instinct seemed to be fighting against the reasonable explanations she was receiving. "Robert, is she eating enough? She sounds so weak, so unlike my Annie." I could hear her turning away from the phone slightly, probably, to wipe away tears she didn't want me to hear in her voice. "Maybe I should come home early. Margaret is doing better, and her neighbor has offered to help with the children." The suggestion sent a bolt of panic through Robert that I could feel in the sudden tension of his hands on my shoulders. "Linda, honey, there's no need for you to cut your visit short," he said, taking the phone from my hands with a smoothness that spoke of long practice. "Annie is fine. just going through some normal growing pains. You know how preteen girls can get moody sometimes. The heat has been tough on all of us, but we're managing just fine." I listened in growing desperation as he painted a picture of domestic harmony, describing how well Michael and I were getting along, how much I was learning about being part of a family, how proud he was of the young woman I was becoming. Every word was a nail in the coffin of my hopes for rescue. Every reassurance to my mother, another step in their plan to separate us forever. When he finally handed the phone back to me, I could hear that my mother's concerns had been temporarily soothed, though something in her voice suggested that her worries hadn't been entirely put to rest. "I love you so much, my darling girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just a few more days, maybe a week at most, and then I'll be home to take care of you myself. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" The irony of her words was devastating, since being brave was exactly what had kept me alive this long, but not in any way she could have imagined. After the phone call ended, Robert and Michael exchanged a look that I had learned to recognize as their signal for one of their planning sessions. They sent me to my room with instructions to get ready for bed, but I could hear their voices through the thin walls as they discussed what they called the timeline. Robert seemed agitated about my mother's suggestion that she might come home early, and I heard him say something about needing to accelerate the schedule and implement the contingency plan. Michael's voice was eager as he responded, and I caught fragments of their conversation that made my blood run cold. They were talking about the possibility of leaving for Nevada within the next few days, before my mother had a chance to return and potentially disrupt their plans. Robert mentioned something about having already spoken to someone at the Riverside Academy, about having made arrangements for my immediate admission under emergency circumstances. As I lay in my bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound in the house, I realized that I was probably living through my last few days of any hope for rescue. Once they got me to that school in Nevada, with my false identity firmly established and my real mother convinced that I needed specialized help, I would disappear as completely as if I had been murdered. The Anne who had spent her childhood braiding daisy chains in the backyard and reading adventure stories under the old oak tree would cease to exist, replaced by some fictional troubled child whose family had sadly given up on her. The next morning brought a development that confirmed my worst fears. Robert announced at breakfast that he had taken a few days off work to spend quality family time together before my mother returned. He made it sound like a generous gesture, a way to create special memories before our lives returned to their normal routine. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he exchanged meaningful glances with Michael when he thought I wasn't looking, and I knew that this unexpected vacation was actually the beginning of the end. They spent that day in a frenzy of preparation that they tried to disguise as normal household activities. Robert cleaned out his car thoroughly, removing anything that might later be used to trace our movements, while Michael packed what he claimed was camping equipment, but which I suspected was actually supplies for our journey to Nevada. They were both unusually cheerful, almost giddy with anticipation, and their good mood made them careless in small ways that allowed me to pick up more details about their plan. I overheard Robert on the phone with someone he called Dr. Morrison, discussing my supposed psychological evaluation and the urgency of getting me into a controlled environment before my condition deteriorated further. His side of the conversation was a masterpiece of fictional concern, describing symptoms I had never exhibited and behaviors that existed only in his imagination. He spoke about my increasing aggression toward Michael, my inappropriate sexual behavior, my threats of self-harm if I wasn't allowed to have my way. Every lie was delivered with such conviction that if I hadn't known better, I might have believed he was genuinely worried about a deeply troubled child. The most chilling part of the conversation came when Robert discussed the financial arrangements. Apparently, the real Dr. Morrison was expecting a substantial payment for accepting me as a patient under emergency circumstances without the usual paperwork and evaluations. Robert assured him that the money would be transferred within 24 hours. of my admission, and that my family understood the need for complete discretion given the sensitive nature of my case. As the day progressed, I began to notice other signs of their impending departure. Robert removed our family photographs from their frames and replaced them with older pictures that didn't include me, as if he was preparing for a future where my existence in this house would need to be explained away or denied entirely. Michael packed a duffel bag with clothes and personal items, but when I asked where he was planning to go, he just smiled and said he was going to visit some friends for a few days. That afternoon, they made me practice the story I would be expected to tell at the Riverside Academy. According to their script, I was a deeply troubled child who had been acting out increasingly since my mother's remarriage, culminating in a violent incident where I had attacked Michael with a kitchen knife and threatened to kill myself if anyone tried to stop me. They made me rehearse the details over and over until I could recite them convincingly, coaching me on how to appear appropriately remorseful and eager for help. The story they had created was diabolically clever because it contained just enough truth to be believable while completely inverting the reality of who was the victim and who was the perpetrator. They had me practicing how to cry on cue when describing my fictional attack on Michael, how to look ashamed when admitting to inappropriate sexual behavior, how to seem grateful for the chance to get help at a place like Riverside Academy. By the time they were satisfied with my performance, I felt like I had been forced to participate in the destruction of my own character and reputation. As evening approached, they became increasingly anxious about the timing of my mother's nightly phone call. Robert paced the living room like a caged animal, checking his watch repeatedly and muttering about schedules and logistics. Michael kept looking out the front window as if he expected to see my mother's taxi pulling up to the house at any moment, even though she had given no indication that her plans had changed. When the phone finally rang at the usual time, Robert answered it before the first ring had finished, his voice artificially cheerful as he greeted my mother. I could hear her asking to speak to me immediately, and there was something different in her tone that made my heart leap with hope. She sounded more alert, more focused, as if some maternal instinct had finally overridden the reasonable explanations she had been accepting. "Annie, baby, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said when Robert reluctantly handed me the phone. "Something doesn't feel right to me, and I'm coming home tomorrow. I've already bought my bus ticket, and I'll be there by tomorrow evening." The words hit me like a lightning bolt of pure hope, but before I could respond, Robert snatched the phone away from me with a violence that he didn't bother to disguise. "Linda, that's really not necessary," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Everything here is fine, and you shouldn't abandon your sister when she still needs you." But my mother was no longer accepting his reassurances, and I could hear her voice rising with determination as she insisted that her daughter needed her more than anyone else right now. The conversation that followed was unlike any I had witnessed between them before. My mother's voice carried a strength and authority that I remembered from before my father's death, a reminder of the woman she had been before grief and financial. Desperation had made her vulnerable to Robert's manipulation. She was no longer asking permission or seeking approval. She was telling him exactly what was going to happen, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Robert seemed to realize that his control over the situation was slipping away. When he finally hung up the phone, his face was pale with rage and something that looked almost like fear. Michael immediately began asking what my mother had said, but Robert silenced him with a sharp gesture and began pacing the room like a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle under extreme time pressure. I sat frozen on the couch, afraid to move or speak, but inside my heart was singing with the knowledge that my mother was coming home, that somehow she had sensed my danger across all those miles and was racing back to save me. But my relief was premature, because I had underestimated the depths of Robert's desperation and the lengths he would go to protect his plans. As I watched his face cycle through anger, fear, and finally a cold determination that chilled me to the bone, I realized that my mother's early return hadn't saved me. It had simply moved up their timeline and made them more dangerous than ever before. "We leave tonight," Robert said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. "Start the car, Michael. We're implementing the emergency protocol." And with those words, I knew that the storm I had been dreading was finally upon us, and that the next few hours would determine whether I would ever see my mother again or disappear forever into the nightmare they had prepared for me. Part 4. The Breaking Point. The sound of Michael starting the car engine in our driveway at 10 o'clock at night shattered the last illusion I had that this might somehow end without violence. Through my bedroom window, I could see the headlights, cutting through the darkness, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I got into that car, I would never see my mother or my real life again. Everything in my 11-year-old body was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything except surrender to the fate they had planned for me. But where could a child run in the middle of the night in suburban Bakersfield with no money, no allies, and no safe haven within reach? Robert appeared in my doorway with that brown leather suitcase in one hand and a small cloth bag in the other, his face set in the cold determination of a man who had moved beyond the point of caring about consequences. He no longer bothered with the pretense of being my caring stepfather. The mask had finally slipped completely away, revealing the predator that had been lurking underneath all along. When he looked at me sitting on my bed in my nightgown, clutching my pillow like a shield, there was no warmth or affection in his eyes, only the calculating gaze of someone assessing a problem that needed to be solved efficiently. "Get dressed," he ordered, his voice devoid of any emotion except impatience. "We're leaving in 5 minutes, and I don't want to hear any crying or arguing. You know what happens to little girls who don't cooperate with their family." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but there was something else there too, desperation that told me he was as frightened as I was, just for very different reasons. His carefully laid plans were unraveling because of my mother's sudden decision to come home early, and now he was improvising in ways that made him dangerous and unpredictable. I pulled on the first clothes my trembling hands could find, a simple blue dress and white sandals that my mother had bought me for church services, and the irony of wearing something so innocent and normal while being kidnapped wasn't lost on me even in my terror. My fingers fumbled with the buttons and straps as Robert watched impatiently from the doorway, occasionally checking his watch and muttering under his breath about timing and schedules. When I was finally dressed, he grabbed my arm with a grip. That would leave bruises and dragged me toward the front door. The house that had been my home for 3 years looked different in the harsh overhead lighting, like a stage set being struck after the final performance. All the small touches that had made it feel like our family's sanctuary were gone or altered, the photographs replaced, the personal items removed. Even the scent in the air changed from my mother's lavender soap to something antiseptic and cold. Robert and Michael had erased our presence so thoroughly that it was as if we had never lived there at all. And I realized that this too was part of their plan, to make it seem like my mother and I had simply moved away rather than been torn apart by violence and deception. Michael was waiting in the running car, drumming his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel while scanning the street for any signs of neighbors who might be awake and curious about our late-night departure. At 14, he looked older behind the wheel, more confident in his cruelty, and I could see that he was excited rather than nervous about what was happening. This was the culmination of everything he had been working toward, the moment when his practice in manipulation and control would be tested on a larger stage, and he was eager to prove himself worthy of his father's training. Robert shoved me into the back seat and climbed in beside me, placing the cloth bag on the seat between us in a way that made my stomach clench with fresh fear. I didn't know what was in that bag, but I remembered the white powder I had seen in his suitcase, and I suspected that he was prepared to use chemical means to keep me quiet and compliant during our journey if I proved troublesome. The casual way he positioned it within easy reach told me that drugging an 11-year-old child was just another necessary step in his plan, no more significant to him than packing snacks for a road trip. As we pulled away from Maple Street, I pressed my face to the window and watched my childhood disappear into the darkness behind us. Mrs. Patterson's house sat silent and dark, her windows reflecting nothing but empty sky, and I wondered if she would even notice that we were gone, or if Robert had prepared some explanation for our sudden absence that would satisfy her casual neighborly concern. The familiar landmarks of my neighborhood flashed past in the headlights like memories being erased, each one taking me further from any possibility of rescue or recognition. The drive through Bakersfield felt like traveling through a ghost town, with empty streets and darkened storefronts creating an atmosphere of isolation that reinforced how completely alone I was in this situation. Robert had chosen this time deliberately, I realized, when decent people were safely asleep in their beds, and the only witnesses to our passage would be shift workers and insomniacs who had no reason to pay attention to one more car on the highway. Even if someone did notice us, what would they see except a normal family traveling at night, perhaps heading out early for a vacation or visiting relatives in another state? We reached the outskirts of town and merged onto Highway 99, heading north toward destinations unknown, and I felt the last threads connecting me to my old life stretching thin and finally snapping. The landscape outside the windows became increasingly alien, rolling hills and farmland that I had never seen before, mile markers counting down the distance between me and everything I had ever known or loved. Michael drove with the radio turned low, some late-night talk show providing a surreal soundtrack to my kidnapping, while Robert sat beside me in silence, occasionally checking his watch and making notations in a small notebook. The white powder made its appearance about an hour into our journey, when my fear and desperation finally overwhelmed my survival instincts, and I began to scream for help despite knowing that no one could hear me. Robert's hand clamped over my mouth with bruising force while he struggled to open the cloth bag with his other hand, his movements clumsy with haste and the awkward angle. The powder had been mixed with something sweet, probably sugar or honey, to disguise the taste, but there was an underlying bitterness that made me gag and try to spit it out. "Swallow it," he commanded, his voice carrying a threat that made my blood freeze. "Swallow it now, or I'll hold your nose until you have no choice." The casual way he discussed suffocating me if I didn't cooperate told me everything I needed to know about how far he was prepared to go to ensure my compliance. I forced myself to swallow the mixture, feeling it burn down my throat like liquid fire, and within minutes the world began to take on a strange, distant quality that made my thoughts feel wrapped in cotton. The drug didn't make me unconscious, but it stole my ability to think clearly or coordinate my movements effectively. I could see and hear everything that was happening around me, but it was as if I was watching someone else's life through a thick piece of glass. My limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, my tongue thick and clumsy when I tried to speak, and the fear that had been driving me to fight back transformed into a dreamy sort of acceptance that I knew was artificial, but couldn't seem to overcome. Michael began talking as we drove deeper into the night, his voice cheerful and conversational as if we were indeed just a family on a pleasant road trip together. He described the Riverside Academy in glowing terms, painting it as a wonderful place where I would learn to be grateful for everything Robert had tried to teach me, where I would finally understand that their treatment of me had been an act of love rather than cruelty. He talked about the other girls who would be there, damaged children like myself who needed firm guidance to overcome their natural wickedness and become productive members of society. The picture he painted was of a Victorian nightmare disguised as therapeutic intervention, a place where children who had been labeled as problems could be isolated from society and subjected to whatever treatment their guardians deemed necessary. There would be no visits from concerned relatives, no oversight from government agencies, no contact with the outside world that might interfere with the important work of rehabilitation. I would be completely at their mercy, with no one to hear my screams or question their methods, until they decided I had been sufficiently broken and rebuilt in the image they preferred. Robert seemed to relax as the drug took hold of me, satisfied that I was no longer capable of causing trouble or attempting to escape. He began making phone calls on a device I had never seen before, some kind of mobile telephone that connected him to his network of accomplices and enablers. I could hear fragments of his conversations, references to delivery schedules and payment confirmations, discussions of paperwork and legal documentation that would make my disappearance appear legitimate and permanent. One call in particular chilled me to the bone, as Robert spoke to someone he addressed as Dr. Morrison about my expected arrival and the need for immediate sedation upon intake. He described me as a violent and unpredictable child who had already been medicated for transport, emphasizing the importance of maintaining chemical restraint until I could be properly evaluated and assigned to an appropriate treatment program. The casual way he discussed drugging and imprisoning an 11-year-old girl made it clear that this was not his first experience with such arrangements. As we drove through the night, passing through small towns that flickered past like scenes from a nightmare, I found myself thinking about my mother with a clarity that cut through the fog of whatever substance they had given me. She would be on a bus somewhere in the darkness, probably unable to sleep as she worried about me, driven by maternal instincts that had finally overcome her trust in the man she had married to protect us. She had no way of knowing that her decision to come home early had actually triggered the very catastrophe she was trying to prevent, that her love for me had inadvertently set in motion the events that were carrying me away from her forever. The thought of her arriving at our empty house tomorrow evening, finding no trace of our presence and no explanation for our disappearance, was almost more painful than my own situation. Robert had undoubtedly prepared some story to explain our absence, probably involving a family emergency or sudden relocation that required immediate departure. By the time she realized that something was seriously wrong, we would be hundreds of miles away, and my new identity would already be established at the Riverside Academy. But even through the chemical haze that clouded my thoughts, I could feel something burning in the center of my chest, a core of fury and determination that refused to be extinguished. They had underestimated the power of a mother's love and the strength that could be found in even the smallest and most vulnerable victim. What they didn't know was that my mother's intuition had been awakened not just by worry, but by love, and that love had a power they couldn't understand or control. As dawn began to break over the highway ahead of us, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that should have been beautiful but felt like a mockery of hope, I made a promise to myself that I would survive whatever they had planned for me. I would endure the Riverside Academy and its horrors. I would maintain my true identity no matter what false names they gave me. And someday, somehow, I would find my way back to my mother and tell the world what these monsters had done. The car began to slow as we approached what looked like a rest stop, and I could see Robert checking his watch again with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully timed plan was proceeding exactly as scheduled. Michael pulled into the parking lot and stopped near a van that was waiting in the shadows, its windows tinted so dark that I couldn't see who was inside. As Robert opened his door and stepped out to speak with whoever was waiting for us, I realized that this was where my journey with them would end, and a new kind of nightmare would begin. But they had made one crucial mistake in their planning, one oversight that would ultimately unravel everything they had worked so hard to achieve. They had assumed that a drugged and terrorized 11-year-old girl would be helpless to resist their plans, but they had forgotten that sometimes the smallest people can carry the biggest surprises. What they didn't know was that my mother had taught me more than just how to braid my hair and fold laundry. She had taught me that love was stronger than fear, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that sometimes the most unexpected heroes emerged from the most desperate circumstances. As I sat in that car watching Robert negotiate the terms of my transfer to whatever fresh hell awaited me, I began planning my own survival with a determination that surprised even me. The breaking point they thought they had reached was not my destruction but my transformation, not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter written in my own hand. Part 5. The Resolution and Wisdom. The police sirens that shattered the dawn silence at that rest stop sounded like the voice of God himself answering prayers I didn't even know I had been sending up to heaven. Through the drug-induced fog that still clouded my thoughts, I watched in amazement as 3 patrol cars surrounded our vehicle and the waiting van, their red and blue lights painting the parking lot in colors of salvation. Robert's face went white as death when he saw the officers emerging from their vehicles with weapons drawn, and Michael's hands began shaking so violently on the steering wheel that the whole car trembled with his terror. What I learned later, when I was finally safe and able to piece together the full story, was that my mother's intuition had been even more powerful than any of us realized. Instead of simply boarding the first bus home when her worries overwhelmed her, she had called Mrs. Patterson to ask her to check on me, just to ease her maternal anxiety during the long journey back to California. When Mrs. Patterson found our house dark and empty at 9 in the morning, with the car gone and no explanation for our absence, she immediately called the police to report what she suspected was a kidnapping in progress. My mother had provided the officers with detailed descriptions of Robert, Michael, and the car, along with her growing suspicions about Robert's treatment of me during her absence. She told them about the strange phone calls, my voice sounding different and distant, the way Robert always seemed to be controlling our conversations. Most importantly, she shared her growing certainty that something terrible was happening to her daughter, even though she couldn't prove it or explain exactly what was wrong. The police had issued an immediate alert for our vehicle, and a sharp-eyed highway patrol officer had spotted us during a routine check of a rest area known for drug trafficking. When he ran the license plate and discovered we were the subject of an active kidnapping investigation, backup was called immediately, and they had been watching us for over an hour, waiting for the right moment to move in safely. The van that was supposed to complete my transfer to the Riverside Academy was actually an undercover police operation that had been tracking the facility for months as part of a larger investigation into child trafficking networks. Robert was arrested on charges that would eventually put him away for life, though the full extent of his crimes wouldn't be revealed until investigators searched his house and found evidence of similar schemes involving other children over the years. The Riverside Academy was shut down within hours of his arrest, and Dr. Morrison was taken into custody along with several staff members who had been complicit in the systematic abuse and exploitation of vulnerable children sent to their facility by predators like Robert. Michael, despite being only 14, was charged as an adult for his role in my kidnapping and abuse. The sophistication of his manipulation techniques and the evidence of his willing participation in planning my disappearance convinced prosecutors that he posed a serious danger to society. He would spend the next several years in juvenile detention and psychiatric treatment, though I often wondered whether someone so young could truly be rehabilitated after being trained in such systematic cruelty by his father. The reunion with my mother at the police station 3 hours later was everything I had dreamed about during those weeks of hell and more. She held me so tightly I could barely breathe, tears streaming down both our faces as we clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck who had been given up for lost. She whispered apologies over and over, blaming herself for leaving me, for trusting Robert, for not recognizing the danger I was in sooner. But I just buried my face in her shoulder and breathed in the familiar scent of her lavender soap, knowing that I was finally, truly safe. The physical evidence of what Robert and Michael had done to me was documented by medical professionals and police investigators, but the emotional healing would take much longer. My mother and I moved to Oregon shortly after the trial, far away from the memories and trauma of Bakersfield, and started building a new life together with the help of therapists and support groups. It was a long, difficult journey, but we had each other, and we had the unbreakable bond that Robert had tried so hard to destroy, but had ultimately only made stronger. Over the years, as I grew up and eventually had children and grandchildren of my own, I came to understand that what happened to me was not just a personal tragedy, but part of a larger pattern of how predators operate in our society. They target vulnerable families, exploit trust and need, and use sophisticated psychological manipulation to isolate their victims and ensure silence. Robert had been counting on the fact that no one would believe an 11-year-old girl over a respected adult man, and that even if someone did listen, the shame and stigma would prevent me from speaking out. But he had underestimated the power of a mother's love and the strength that can emerge from the darkest experiences. My mother's refusal to ignore her instincts, even when everyone around her was telling her she was overreacting, saved my life and exposed a network of child abusers that had been operating for years. Her courage in trusting her maternal intuition over social expectations became the foundation for my own healing and my eventual ability to help other survivors find their voices. Today, sitting in my sunroom in Portland with my tea grown cold and the afternoon light fading outside my windows, I can look back on that terrible summer of 1963 and see it not just as a period of victimization, but as the beginning of my understanding of human resilience. Yes, there are monsters in this world who prey on the innocent and vulnerable. Yes, evil exists in forms that can be charming and persuasive and difficult to recognize until it's almost too late. But there is also love that transcends understanding, intuition that defies logic, and strength that emerges from the most unlikely sources. I learned that healing is not about forgetting or forgiving what happened to you, but about reclaiming your power and using your experience to protect others who might face similar dangers. I became a social worker specializing in child protection, and later a counselor who helped other survivors understand that their trauma did not define their worth or limit their potential for happiness. Every child I helped save, every family I helped heal, was a victory not just for them, but for that 11-year-old girl who refused to surrender her identity to the monsters who tried to steal it. The nightmares eventually faded, though they never disappeared completely. The hypervigilance and trust issues took years of therapy to overcome, and some scars remain tender even today. But I also gained something invaluable from that experience: an absolute certainty that love is stronger than hatred, that truth will eventually triumph over lies, and that even the smallest person can make a difference when they refuse to give up hope. My mother lived to be 93 years old, and every day of her long life she carried the knowledge that her instincts and her love had saved me from a fate worse than death. She never remarried, never again trusted her heart to someone who might hurt her child. But she built a beautiful life filled with purpose and joy, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that she had fought for what mattered most, and won. The most important lesson I learned from that terrible summer is that we are never as powerless as our abusers want us to believe. Even when we are small, even when we are afraid, even when we are alone, we carry within us the capacity for survival and the seeds of our own liberation. Sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to accept that the cruelty inflicted on us represents our true worth or defines our future possibilities. For anyone listening to this story who may be facing their own nightmare of abuse or betrayal, please know that you are not alone, you are not powerless, and you are not defined by what others have done to you. Trust your instincts, reach out for help, and never stop believing that you deserve safety, love, and respect. Your voice matters, your truth matters, and your life has value beyond anything those who hurt you could ever understand. And to the mothers and fathers and caregivers who are listening, trust those instincts that tell you something is wrong, even when you can't prove it or explain it rationally. Your children are counting on you to see beyond the masks that predators wear, to hear the silence behind their coached words, and to fight for them even when fighting seems impossible. Love gives us a kind of sight that logic cannot explain, and sometimes that sight is the only thing standing between our children and unimaginable harm. The story I've shared with you today is not an easy one to tell or to hear, but it's a story that needed to be told because somewhere out there, someone needs to know that survival is possible, that healing is achievable, and that the love between a mother and child can overcome even the most calculated evil. That 11-year-old girl who thought her world was ending couldn't have imagined that she would someday be sitting in a beautiful home, surrounded by family and friends, telling her story not as a victim, but as a survivor who found her strength. in the darkest hour and used it to light the way for others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.